It has been for me a bit of a weird week for sleeping. Several of my nights have been like a demented version of Sesame Street. Tonight's show is brought to you by the numbers 3 and 4 a.m. Add in a periodic twinge in my lower back muscles, which are always where I store my stress, and it's a clue that my intermittent anxiety mode is kicking in. Ironically, I think it has to do with my upcoming sabbatical, which starts in about 169 hours. I mean, of course, there's the checklist. Complete last-minute tasks, send this email, remember this detail, overfunction enough to compensate and prepare for what feels like months of underfunctioning. Try to straighten up my desk a little bit, though who am I kidding? My desk is never straight. But it's more than that, too. So if you'll let me, I'd like to try to talk it through. I also have, and don't stop me here, I also have some genuine guilt about the idea of receiving a sabbatical. I mean, who gets that privilege? The farmers in my first congregation don't get a sabbatical. They seldom get a Saturday away from their work. The checkout clerk at the grocery store doesn't get a sabbatical. What about nurses or accountants? Most of you won't ever take a sabbatical, so what have I done to deserve one? And what I've worked around to is nothing. A pastor's sabbatical cannot be earned or deserved. It is a gift for which I am lastingly grateful. It's a gift for me, and I hope also a gift for grace. More on that in a minute. But I also think it's a gift with a purpose. It isn't like a recognition and honor of something, like receiving a watch for retirement or receiving a trip to Acapulco for being salesperson of the year. Again, those are things that are somehow earned or merited or deserved, and I don't believe a sabbatical is. But if I look for it, and if together we look for it, I think there is a biblical grounding for the notion of a pastoral sabbatical. I mean, for starters, it's right there in the Word. Sabbath is the root word for sabbatical, and one purpose of Sabbath is rest, which God built into the fabric of creation. On the seventh day, God, yes, even God, rested from God's labors. God built a pause into the rhythm of life, and for my part, I think an extended period of rest will be good for my ministry. Not a 3-month nap, not that kind of rest. I think more like headspace. I think I can use just a bit of headspace, and I hope that you will see the benefit as a result of it. In 31 years of ordained ministry, I've written and preached just over 1,300 sermons, and in that time, I can just about count on one hand the number of times I've gone more than 2 weeks without preaching. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but I've hardly had a theological thought that I haven't written down or spoken aloud. And within that space, there have been some periods, and you've endured some periods, where the well has run dry, where it's hard to find a new idea or a fresh perspective on the biblical text. Writer's block can be a real thing. When a pitcher has thrown a lot of pitches, the arm starts to get tired, and the fastball starts to lose its zip. So maybe when a preacher has preached a lot of sermons, the brain starts to get tired. Maybe the sermons start to lose their zip. Maybe it's the congregation that starts to get tired. Maybe we all could use a little rest. So seriously, I hope for some renewal in my preaching. Another purpose is an intentional period of reflection as opposed to constant action. Again, turning to the creation myth for instruction, on the seventh day, when God was intentionally not creating anything, God paused and looked upon the whole of God's creation. In other words, God didn't just hit pause on creating because God was tuckered out. God took a wider view. God looked at everything all together instead of looking at one thing. Now, in trying to relate that to ministry, the step back, the wider view, is important. It's easy to become so focused upon particular tasks that you begin to lose sight of the larger project. You've heard the phrase, "too busy wrestling alligators to drain the swamp." In that metaphorical description, the alligators are real. They represent immediate problems or issues that come up. They need to be dealt with, but there's also a need for a broader perspective, and it's one that we too often fail to take, one that we pastors too often fail to take. So it's helpful to climb a tree for a bit. Alligators don't climb trees, I don't think. Anyway, it's helpful to get up out of the swamp of one's immediate surroundings, take a beat, look at the alligators, look at the whole picture, and consider it. How do we go about draining this swamp? But then, maybe other unexpected questions, important questions, present themselves. Should we drain the swamp? Is it a worthwhile enterprise? For what purpose exactly are we draining this swamp? Are we destroying an entire ecosystem to put in condominiums? What exactly are we doing here? The pause for perspective permits time and space for the consideration of a larger picture. What's the larger purpose of our busyness? And I hope that I can return from sabbatical with some fresh perspective on this larger enterprise of ministry that we undertake together. I hope to have a renewed sense of my purpose and some fresh thoughts to share as this congregation continues to live out its purpose. And I hope that my temporary absence gives you space to think as well. Pauses of this sort are important enough that God not only built rest and perspective taking into the rhythm of creation, in our first scripture reading, God makes them central to the 10 Commandments, which might be considered the recipe for a holy and faithful life. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, that is, set apart. Keep it undisturbed. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You or your son or daughter or your male or female servant, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. Sabbath is a time of rest and perspective taking for everyone in the entire economic system, for everything in the entire creation. Healing time. But Sabbath is a weekly rhythm. How does it relate to sabbatical? Usually a 7-year rhythm, and specifically to the purpose of my taking a pastoral sabbatical. I'm still working it out here. But in my 4 a.m. wool gathering, I thought of the second passage of Scripture that we're considering for today. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its yield, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the wild animals may eat. You shall do the same with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. And the instruction is repeated in slightly different words in Leviticus. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops, but in the 7th year the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. A sabbatical, it seems to me, is more like these passages, where farmers are instructed to let their land or a portion of it lie fallow every 7th year. it seems counterintuitive. I mean, the purpose of farming is to produce results, to yield crops. So what is the benefit of ceasing production, of intentionally pausing it? In the 7th year, farming the land equates to not tilling it, not cultivating it, letting it go wild for a season. Well, I had to get my head around that one because I'm a child of the age of chemical fertilizer. But in ancient times, you couldn't just buy a bag of 10-10-10 fertilizer with nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, and micronutrients to refresh the soil. Crops consume nutrients from the soil, and those nutrients must somehow be replenished in order for the soil to remain productive. So in that 7th year, that fallow season, it isn't that the land is doing nothing at all. It's doing something different. It isn't that nothing at all is growing. Leave a field of tilled soil untended and something will grow in it. Seeds that are transplanted by birds or sown by the wind, or seeds that have lain dormant but suddenly find season to sprout. If you stop growing cabbages, maybe milkweed springs up. The field grows wild for a season. Maybe worms work the soil or certain types of soil bacteria. I don't know. I'm not a farmer or a soil scientist. I just play one on TV. But when the farmer hits pause on that field, God hits start or refresh on that field. And it grows what it needs in order to restore itself. Now, in trying to relate that thought to my sabbatical, which I hope in its way is also a sabbatical for grace, if I'm not around to plant cabbages for a season, perhaps something fresh springs up. Things that have been dormant, seeds of newness that are in the wind. And if I'm not in the way for a bit, and I don't mean in the way as a negative term, only as a descriptive one, in the same way that a farmer gets out of the way of what's happening in a field, if I'm simply not around for a bit, the field of our shared ministry will grow differently. There may be voices that are not being heard because my voice is so present. There may be viewpoints that are going unseen because my leadership has blind spots. I don't mean to imply that I'm the only one contributing to the vision, far from that. But in a season of lying fallow or a season of growing differently, things are going to happen in a different way for 3 months at Grace. And the congregation will have a chance to hear some different voices from the pulpit. At my last church, I walked into the choir room one day, and this will surprise none of you. I walked into the choir room one day, and my stole was completely askew, 6 inches longer on one side than the other. And the choir pointed it out and helped me to correct it, and I made some lame joke about wearing my stole askew so that people couldn't see which way I was leaning. And one of the choir members quipped, "Oh, we know how you lean." Which is true. The congregation receives a steady diet of my perspectives, my biases, my theology, my worldviews, my words, my messages. You know something of what I'm likely to say on any given week. When Walter Brueggemann was here, he joked of telling a friend that he had written a new book, one of dozens upon dozens of books, and the friend said, "What did you call it this time?" My point is, authors or preachers have a voice, a perceptible perspective, a lean that arises from their experiences, from their personality, from their ideas about what God is up to in the world. And a sabbatical is a time for me not to preach those sermons and to go experience something different. And it's a time for grace not to hear those sermons, to hear different voices and fresh insights and a different kind of wisdom. The sabbatical is also a time for me to learn and for the church to learn that the church functions perfectly well without me. It's an exercise in humility for me, and it's a chance for the congregation to use some different muscles. One part of the Lilly Sabbatical grant that we received is $9,000 to enable some ministry partnerships and fellowship events with our Springfield area congregations to explore how our churches can partner with one another to cultivate this corner of God's kingdom. And what's that going to look like? What will Grace be doing? I don't know. No idea, even though I wrote that part of the grant. I do not know because I've talked with Pastor Katie and some conversation partners, and we've batted around a few general ideas, and now I'm going to go away for a bit and leaving the mission committee, the session, this congregation, and several other congregations to bake that particular cake. What are your ideas? What are your strengths? How would you like to see Grace stretch and grow? And how will it work with you working alongside your partner churches to create something new and accomplish it? I can't wait to come back and find out what we're doing. That is what it's like to let something that you didn't plant spring up in your field. And the reason I think all of that's important, it's helpful to me to see Grace not only as who we are now, but also as who Grace was before most of us ever showed up on the scene, and who Grace will be after none of us are here. Grace has thrived for almost 75 years under different pastors, with different congregational leaders, and under entirely different times and different conditions. It is healthy. It is even necessary to let fresh leadership take the reins for a bit. It's called cathedral thinking, and we results-focused moderns have trouble doing it. Cathedral thinking is where you take part in a work that is much, much, much larger than you are, and you contribute significantly to it for a season or for a lifetime. But cathedrals are too vast or complex to be built in a single generation. And here I'm thinking in particular of a medieval cathedral built without the benefit of heavy machinery to move the earth or specialized equipment to cut the stone. One generation of stonemasons might complete one portion of one wall. In cathedral thinking, everyone is important, but no one is irreplaceable, because everyone will by definition be replaced. The enterprise is that large. And as to who is in charge of the church, who sets the vision, who calls the shots, well, our theology tells us that Christ is the head of the church. A church is not a mechanical thing managed by tinkering. It is a living and growing thing managed only by tending. And a season of growing differently is life replenishing. I'd like to share briefly from a prayer often attributed to Oscar Romero, but actually written by Bishop Ken Unterer to mark the anniversary of Bishop Romero's martyrdom. Bishop Unterer writes, "It helps now and then to step back and take the long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is even beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is another way of saying the kingdom lies always beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the church's mission. No set of goals or objectives includes everything. This is what we're about. We plant seeds that one day will grow. We water the seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects far beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything, and there's a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something and do it well. It may be incomplete, but it's a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future that is not our own. Well, those are just a few thoughts. I have no idea how this sabbatical thing is going to work out. I've never taken one. I don't know what will spring up unbidden or unplanned, but not unneeded or unwelcome in the life of the congregation. I don't know what the impact will be on me, on my preaching, on my ministry. In about 168 hours and 40 minutes, I'm headed out the door to the Culinary Institute of America to learn some new ways of cooking. And metaphorically, the congregation is going to eat somebody else's cooking for a bit and find that it's good and maybe better. What important growth will spring up from a field tended differently? Well, by the grace of God, we're about to find out. Hmm.